The major faints as he moves to the outer door, knocking the music stand bar out from the door's handle. One of the first people into the state box is Dr. Charles Leal, who rushes to the aid of the president. At first, there's no breath or pulse, but as the president is moved to the floor of the box, somehow he begins to breathe again. All the doctor saw was the knife Booth was carrying, so at first he searches for stab wounds on Lincoln's body. The president's eyes indicate a head wound of some kind. Searching further, the doctor discovers a half-inch hole behind the president's left ear. He knows immediately that the wound is a fatal one. No one wants the president to die in the theater. They want to move him to a bed. But where? The White House is too far away, and no one in the neighborhood seems to be home that night. As federal troops and Dr. Leal carry the president out the door of the theater into the crowded street, they spot a man holding a candle waving to them from the steps of the Peterson boarding house across the street. Fighting their way through the crowd, they carry the president up the stairs and down a narrow hallway to a small 9 by 17-foot room, laying him diagonally across the bed. Lincoln remained unconscious throughout the night, breathing lightly, with Mrs. Lincoln and Dr. Leal by his side. Other physicians and several government officials would also visit that night, all realizing that the end may be near. The next morning at 7:22 a.m., President Abraham Lincoln was pronounced dead. He was 56 years old.
In the case of the action team that Booth had assembled, the most active member of that group was Lewis Thornton Powell, who was assigned to kill and murder Secretary of State William Seward. And Powell almost did that. He went to Seward's home right near here in downtown Washington, near the White House, entered the house forcibly, and that time Seward was in bed at night. Forced his way into Seward's bedroom, had a gun in his hand. The gun misfired. He took the gun, hit one of Seward's sons on the head, then broke his way into Seward's bedroom, had a big knife in his hand, stabbed Secretary of State Seward in his face twice. At that point, Seward's nurse, a man by the name of George Robinson, jumped on the murderer, ripped him off Seward's body, and made sure that Seward was not killed. But Seward suffered very severe wounds and recovered eventually to buy Alaska in 1867. A third guy, George Astrott, was assigned to kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson. He did not do it at all, period.
But what about John Wilkes Booth? What would become of the man who had killed a president for the first time in American history? After leaving Ford's Theater, Booth headed south across the Navy Yard Bridge and into Maryland, where he met up with a fellow conspirator named David Harold. The two men rode to the Surratt Tavern, where Mary Surratt gave them weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. Continuing south, Booth and Harold arrived at the home of Dr. Mudd at about 4 o'clock the next morning. Dr. Mudd treated Booth's injured ankle, and the two men rested at Dr. Mudd's house for several hours. By this time, a bounty had been posted for the capture of Booth and his co-conspirators, and a widespread manhunt was underway. The next day, Booth and Harold headed through the Zikia Swamp, guided by Oswald Swan, a free black. Swan took the men to the home of Colonel Samuel Cox, where they stayed for the next 4 days. On April 20th, they crossed the Potomac River, but accidentally ended up back in Maryland instead of Virginia. The next night, they made their way across the river to Virginia, where another co-conspirator, Thomas Harbin, took them to the home of Dr. Richard Stewart. But Dr. Stewart would not allow Booth and Harold to stay at his home. So the two men went to the cabin of William Lucas, another free black, and forcibly removed Lucas and his family from their home for the night. The next day, as Booth and Harold crossed the Rappahannock River, they were met by 3 former Confederate soldiers who led them to shelter in the tobacco shed at Garrett's farm. It was here that Federal soldiers, who had been hot on their trail from the beginning, finally caught up with the fugitives. Facing overwhelming odds, Harold quickly surrendered and came out of the tobacco shed, but Booth held fast. So around 4 a.m., the soldiers set the tobacco shed on fire. Within minutes, flames had engulfed the entire structure. Booth could be seen through the burning walls with a pistol and rifle in his hands. One of the soldiers, named Boston Corbett, fired his pistol. Booth fell to the ground and was quickly dragged from the burning shed. He had been shot fatally in the neck.
Because Booth is paralyzed from the neck on down. He can't move his arms or legs after being shot in the neck. Shot in the vertebrae. So at that point, Booth whispers to his soldiers. He says, show me my arms. Let me see my arms. His arms are lifted up in front of his face. Looks at his arms and says, useless, useless, his last words, useless, and dies. That's just before sunrise, April 26, 1865.
As for Ford's Theater, it was closed immediately following the assassination. Its stage would not host another dramatic performance for more than 100 years. The theater building itself would undergo several different transformations during the next century. At different times, it served as a museum, a warehouse, even an office building. It wasn't until 1964 that the government authorized funds to restore Ford's Theater to a center for the performing arts. And in 1968, Helen Hayes graced the new stage at the theater's gala reopening. She was the first actress to appear at Ford's Theater since Laura Keene starred in Our American Cousin, that infamous night of April 14, 1865.
As most people know in this country, the one president of this country that's always admired and given the most respect to is, of course, Mr. Lincoln. And with that in mind, we also know that many people come to Washington to get right with Mr. Lincoln. And most of those people come to Washington to see the Lincoln Memorial. But there's one thing about the Lincoln Memorial that we don't remember too much about, and that is he was never there. Mr. Lincoln was never at the Lincoln Memorial, but in the last day of his life, he was here at Ford's. So if anyone wants to find Mr. Lincoln's spirit, it's here at Ford's, because he was here in the last day of his life. That's why, to me, Ford's is so important. I want to find this Mr. Lincoln. He's here, still here today. His spirit, his drive, his intelligence, he's still here today.
Ford's Theater is thriving today, both as an active theater and as an historic site. It stands as a constant reminder of an extraordinary moment in the life of this country. Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth both left their mark on American history, and in so many ways, their legacies are still being felt today. Thank you for joining us for this edition of World Museum Classics. I'm Amanda Grove. See you next time.